Don't embarrass us at the wedding, my son Trevor said, looking me up and down like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. 3 hours later, the bride's father, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Beaumont, approached me at the reception and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I wanted to thank you personally for raising such a wonderful young man." In that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about respect, family, and my place in this world was about to shatter completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Trevor's wedding started like every other morning in Maplewood Heights had for the past 18 months, with me questioning whether I belonged anywhere at all. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, adjusting the navy blue dress I'd bought 3 weeks ago from Nordstrom Rack. It wasn't designer, but it was elegant, appropriate, and fit me well. At 54, I'd learned to dress for my body type, choosing pieces that made me feel confident, rather than trying to chase trends meant for women half my age. But confidence was a fragile thing in the Harrington household these days. My fingers fumbled with the clasp of my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one piece of jewelry I'd inherited when she passed 5 years ago. These pearls had seen better days, but they were real, classic, and they made me feel connected to a time when I felt worthy of beautiful things. I'd planned to wear them today as something borrowed, something that connected 4 generations of strong women in our family. "Mom, are you seriously wearing that?" Trevor's voice cut through my reflection like a blade. I turned to find him standing in my doorway, already dressed in his black tuxedo, looking every bit the successful investment banker he'd become. At 28, Trevor commanded respect in boardrooms across downtown Riverside City. His colleagues called him sharp, decisive, a rising star. But when he looked at me, all I saw was disappointment. "What's wrong with it?" I asked, my hand instinctively moving to smooth the fabric at my waist. "It's just," he sighed heavily, the way he did when he was about to explain something to someone he considered intellectually inferior. "Look, Vivien's family is going to be there. Her father owns half the commercial real estate in Willowbrook County. Her mother sits on the board of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. These aren't your book club friends from the community center." I felt my cheeks burn. "I'm aware of who will be attending your wedding, Trevor." "Are you, though?" He stepped into my room without being invited, his eyes scanning my dresser with its modest collection of drugstore makeup and discount perfumes. "Because honestly, Mom, sometimes I think you forget that not everyone lives like—" He gestured vaguely around my bedroom, taking in the furniture I'd bought secondhand and refinished myself, the curtains I'd sewn from clearance fabric, the family photos and frames from the dollar store. "Like what?" The words came out sharper than I intended. "Like they're still struggling." He straightened his tie in my mirror, seemingly unaware of how his words were landing. "Look, I've worked really hard to build something here. Vivien and we move in certain circles now. There are expectations." I watched him in the mirror, this stranger who looked like the little boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out when Trevor was 3. The little boy who used to help me plant tomatoes in our tiny backyard garden, who would proudly wear the sweaters I knitted him, even when the other kids teased him about them being homemade. When had that boy learned to be ashamed of me? "What exactly are you asking me to do, Trevor?" He turned away from the mirror to face me directly. "Just try to blend in, okay? Don't talk about your job at the library too much. Don't mention that you're renting this place instead of owning it. And maybe consider updating your wardrobe a little. Vivien's been dropping hints about taking you shopping, but you always change the subject." The pearl suddenly felt heavy around my neck. "Your fiancé wants to take me shopping?" "She's trying to help, Mom. We both are." His voice softened slightly, but there was still that edge of condescension that had become so familiar. "I know you think you look fine, but there's a difference between looking fine for Maplewood Heights and looking appropriate for the Riverside Country Club." I sat down on the edge of my bed, my hands folded in my lap. For 18 months, ever since Trevor had gotten engaged to Vivien Ashford, I'd felt like I was slowly disappearing. Every family dinner became a subtle lesson in etiquette. Every conversation somehow circled back to what was acceptable and what wasn't. I'd started declining their invitations, making excuses about being tired or having plans, because it was easier than feeling inadequate for 2 hours straight. "I've been looking forward to this day for months," I said quietly. "I just want to celebrate my son getting married." Trevor's expression softened for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the boy who used to curl up next to me on the couch for movie nights. "I want that too, Mom. I really do. But I also want—" He paused, searching for words. "I want to be proud. I want people to see where I came from and understand how far I've come, not wonder why I haven't helped my family catch up. Catch up, as if my entire life was something to be overcome." I nodded slowly, not trusting my voice. "I understand." "Do you?" He checked his watch, a Rolex that cost more than I made in 3 months at the Maplewood Public Library. "Because I need to know that you're going to be appropriate today. This isn't just about us anymore. Vivien's father is considering me for a partnership in his development firm. These connections matter." "I'll be appropriate," I promised, though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. Trevor smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd given me in weeks. "Good. And Mom, try to have fun, okay? Just quietly." After he left, I sat alone in my bedroom for a long time, staring at my reflection. The woman in the mirror looked tired, uncertain, smaller somehow than she had an hour ago. I thought about changing into something even more conservative, maybe removing the pearls, definitely toning down the lipstick that suddenly seemed too bright, too attention-seeking. But something in me resisted. These pearls had been worn by a woman who raised 6 children during the Depression. This dress had been chosen by a woman who had worked 2 jobs to put her son through college. This lipstick had been applied by a woman who deserved to feel beautiful on her son's wedding day. I wasn't sure yet what appropriate was supposed to mean, but I was about to find out. And something told me that by the end of this day, everything I thought I knew about my place in Trevor's life, and in my own life, was going to change completely. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The drive to St. Augustine's Cathedral should have been filled with excitement. Instead, I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head, practicing safe topics that wouldn't embarrass Trevor. Weather, always acceptable. The beauty of the venue, appropriately complimentary. My work at the library, to be avoided unless directly asked, and even then, keep it brief. This mental checklist had become second nature over the past 1.5 years. Every interaction with Trevor and Vivien's social circle required this kind of preparation, this careful editing of myself. I had learned which stories from Trevor's childhood were charming and which ones revealed too much about our financial struggles. I'd memorized which restaurants were acceptable to mention and which ones branded me as hopelessly middle class. The cathedral parking lot was already filling with luxury cars. BMWs, Mercedes, a few Audis scattered throughout. My 12-year-old Honda Civic looked exactly like what it was: transportation for someone who couldn't afford to view cars as status symbols. I parked in the back row, hoping distance might make it less noticeable. Inside the cathedral, I was greeted by Vivien's wedding coordinator, a sharp-dressed woman named Patricia, who clutched a clipboard like a weapon. "Mother of the groom?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew and wasn't particularly pleased about it. "Yes, I'm—" "Wonderful. You'll be seated in the 3rd row," bride sighed. She made a note on her clipboard without looking up. "Actually, I think there might be some confusion. I'm Trevor's mother, so I should be on the groom's side." Patricia's smile was practiced and cold. Mrs. Ashford specifically requested that immediate family from both sides sit together on the bride's side for aesthetic photos. The groom's side will be for business associates and college friends. I felt my face flush. I see. Your corsage is being delivered to your seat. Pink roses to complement the bride's color scheme. Another note on the clipboard. Please remember that the photographer will be taking family photos immediately after the ceremony, so touch-ups should be minimal. She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the vestibule, feeling like an actor who'd forgotten her lines. Around me, other guests moved with the confident ease of people who belonged. Women in designer dresses chatted about their recent trips to the Hamptons. Men in perfectly tailored suits discussed golf handicaps and stock portfolios. I recognized a few faces from previous gatherings. Vivien's college sorority sisters, Trevor's colleagues from Meridian Financial, various members of what Trevor called the network. These were people who spoke in code about summer houses, and the club, and daddy's business. They were kind enough in small doses, but I always felt like I was visiting a foreign country where I didn't quite speak the language. "Helen, there you are." I turned to find Vivien approaching in her wedding dress, looking like something from a fairy tale. At 26, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that came from good genes, excellent skincare, and regular visits to high-end salons. Her smile was radiant, genuine, and for a moment I felt the warmth I'd once shared with this young woman. "You look absolutely stunning," I said, and meant it. "Thank you. And you look lovely too. That dress is so classic." There was a slight pause before the word classic, the kind of pause that made me wonder if she meant timeless or outdated. Vivien's mother, Constance Ashford, appeared beside us as if materialized from thin air. She was the kind of woman who made an entrance simply by existing, perfectly coiffed silver hair, a Chanel suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and the bearing of someone accustomed to deference. "Helen, darling," she said, air kissing near my cheek without actually making contact. "How wonderful that you could make it." Could make it. As if attending my own son's wedding was optional. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Constance." "Of course not. Now I hope you don't mind, but I've taken the liberty of arranging seating that will be most photogenic for the ceremony. You know how important these pictures will be for the couple's future. Their future. Always their future, as if my presence was somehow temporary, something to be managed until it could be phased out entirely." Patricia mentioned the seating arrangement. "That's very thoughtful of you." Constance's smile was sharp as cut crystal. "I do try to think of everything. Speaking of which, I hope you received the information packet about the reception timeline. We'll be doing formal introductions during cocktail hour, and I want to make sure everyone knows their role." I hadn't received any information packet, but nodding seemed safer than admitting ignorance. "Of course." "Wonderful. Now if you'll excuse us, we need to finish getting Vivien ready. The photographer wants to capture some mother-daughter moments before the ceremony." They swept away, leaving me alone again in the vestibule. I watched them go, noting how naturally they moved together, how their conversation picked up mid-sentence as if I'd never interrupted it. Constance's hand rested protectively on Vivien's elbow, guiding her through the crowd with the assurance of someone who belonged. I found my seat in the third row and examined the pink rose corsage waiting for me. It was beautiful, professionally arranged, and completely wrong for my navy dress. But pointing that out would only confirm what everyone already seemed to believe, that I didn't understand how these things worked. Around me, guests continued to file in. I recognized Trevor's college roommate, his boss from Meridian Financial, several couples from their country club. On the rare occasions when someone acknowledged me, it was with the polite but distant smile reserved for service providers or distant relatives. "Excuse me, are you Helen Carlyle?" I looked up to find a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and silver hair. He was probably in his early 60s, wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo with the casual elegance of someone comfortable in formal wear. "Yes, I am." I'm Richard Beaumont, Vivien's father. I wanted to introduce myself before the ceremony begins. He extended his hand and I shook it, surprised by the genuine warmth in his greeting. It's so nice to finally meet you, Mr. Beaumont. Vivien speaks of you often. All good things, I hope, he said with a gentle smile. And please, call me Richard. We're family now, after all. Family. When was the last time someone had used that word to include me rather than exclude me? I've been looking forward to meeting Trevor's mother. From everything I hear, you raised quite an exceptional young man. I felt tears threaten and blinked them back quickly. Thank you, that's very kind. Not kind, just honest. It takes something special to raise a child who turns out as well as Trevor has. You should be very proud. Before I could respond, the organ music began, signaling the start of the ceremony. Richard smiled and squeezed my hand gently. We'll talk more at the reception. I have a feeling we have a lot in common. As he walked away to take his place, I realized I was sitting straighter, breathing easier. For the first time in months, someone had looked at me and seen a person worth talking to, a mother worth respecting. But that moment of warmth was quickly overshadowed by the familiar anxiety as Trevor appeared at the altar. He looked handsome, confident, every inch the successful man he'd worked so hard to become. When his eyes found mine in the crowd, he gave me a small nod. Acknowledgement, not quite approval, but at least recognition that I was there and hadn't yet done anything to embarrass him. I settled back in my seat, corsage pinned awkwardly to my dress, and prepared to watch my son marry into a world where I would always be a visitor, never a resident. The routine was established. Smile when appropriate, speak when spoken to, and above all, remember my place. But Richard Beaumont's kindness lingered like a warm hand on my shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, I wondered if the place everyone seemed to have assigned me was the place I actually belonged. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Trevor looked at me with admiration instead of embarrassment, when my opinions mattered, when I was the hero of his story instead of the obstacle he had to overcome. The transformation began 3 years ago, though I didn't recognize it at the time. Trevor had just started his position at Meridian Financial, fresh out of his MBA program at Northwestern. He was 25, ambitious, and hungry to prove himself in a world that valued pedigree as much as performance. I remember the first time he brought Vivien home to our small duplex in Maplewood Heights. It was a Saturday afternoon in October, and I'd spent the morning making his favorite apple cinnamon coffee cake from scratch, the same recipe I'd used for his birthday every year since he was 7. The house smelled like home, warm and welcoming, filled with the accumulated comfort of 2 decades of memories. Vivien had been polite that day, genuinely curious about the photo albums I'd eagerly pulled out to show her. She'd laughed at the pictures of Trevor's gap-toothed grin, asked thoughtful questions about his Little League trophies, and complimented the coffee cake with what seemed like sincere appreciation. Trevor had been relaxed, proud even, wrapping his arm around my shoulders when I told the story about how he'd once tried to give his sandwich to a homeless man when he was 8 years old. That sounds just like him, Vivien had said, smiling at Trevor with the kind of love that made my heart swell, always trying to take care of everyone. But something shifted after that visit. It was subtle at first. Trevor suggesting we meet at restaurants instead of at home, declining my invitations to Sunday dinner because he and Vivien had plans. When I did see them, there were small corrections. The way I held my fork was too casual. The stories I told revealed too much about our modest circumstances. My enthusiasm about a new book display at the library was met with polite but distant smiles. The real education began when Vivien invited me to her family's annual charity gala 6 months later. It was my first glimpse into the Ashford world, and I was completely unprepared for the magnitude of the difference between their life and mine. The event was held at the Willowbrook Country Club, a sprawling estate with manicured grounds and a ballroom that could have housed my entire duplex twice over. Women floated past in gowns that cost more than my car, discussing their children's private schools and their husbands' latest business acquisitions, Men clustered around the bar, their conversations peppered with names I recognized from newspaper business sections and political coverage. I'd worn my best dress, a black cocktail dress I'd bought for my friend Janet's daughter's wedding 2 years earlier. It was appropriate, I thought, maybe even elegant, but within 5 minutes of walking into that ballroom, I understood that appropriate wasn't enough. There was a language of luxury I'd never learned to speak, a set of unwritten rules I'd never been taught. Constance Ashford had been gracious that night, introducing me to other mothers as Trevor's dear mother, Helen. But I caught the subtle emphasis, the way she positioned me as someone to be accommodated rather than celebrated. The conversations were polite but shallow, skimming across topics I knew nothing about. Vacation homes in Martha's Vineyard, private art collections, investment strategies for tax shelters. Trevor had watched me that night with a growing tension I'd never seen before. When I mentioned that I'd gotten my dress on sale at Macy's, he'd changed the subject quickly. When I told someone about the literacy program I'd started at the library, he gently steered me away from the conversation. By the end of the evening, I felt like I was being managed, protected from my own inadequacies. The drive home that night was quiet. Finally, Trevor spoke. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something." "What is it, sweetheart?" He'd pulled into my driveway but hadn't turned off the engine. "I love you. You know that, right? You're amazing, and I'm grateful for everything you've done for me." There was a but coming. I could hear it in his voice. "But Vivien's world is different. These people, they have different expectations, different ways of doing things. And if I'm going to succeed in this business, if we're going to build the kind of life we want together, I need to understand those expectations." "What does that have to do with me?" He'd stared straight ahead through the windshield. "Sometimes you say things or do things that, well, they remind people that I didn't grow up the way they did. And that's not necessarily bad, but it can make things complicated for me professionally." The words hit me like cold water. "I embarrass you." "No, Mom, that's not what I'm saying." But his hesitation told me it was exactly what he was saying. "I'm saying that maybe we could work together to help you feel more comfortable in these situations. Vivien offered to take you shopping, help you learn some of the social protocols. As if knowing which fork to use for salad could erase 25 years of single motherhood, could transform a librarian's salary into inherited wealth, could make me worthy of their acceptance. That conversation began what Trevor called my social education. Vivien, to her credit, approached it with genuine kindness. She took me to department stores I'd never dared enter, taught me about designers and labels, explained the subtle differences between appropriate and acceptable. She showed me how to navigate cocktail party conversations, which topics were safe, and which ones revealed too much about my background. I learned that mentioning I'd worked 2 jobs to put Trevor through college made people uncomfortable. That talking about clipping coupons or shopping sales made me seem small. That my pride in Trevor's scholarships actually highlighted our financial limitations rather than his achievements. Slowly, I began to edit myself. I stopped telling stories about our early years, when it was just Trevor and me against the world. I learned to deflect questions about my work, my interests, my opinions. I practiced responding to questions about Trevor's father, with vague references to an amicable divorce, rather than the truth that David Carlisle had walked out when the responsibilities of parenthood interfered with his dream of becoming a musician. The most painful part was watching Trevor's relief as I became less myself. He relaxed at social gatherings when I mastered the art of pleasant but forgettable conversation. He smiled approvingly when I learned to dress appropriately for their events. He seemed genuinely proud when Constance Ashford commented that I was adapting beautifully to their social circle. But somewhere in that process of adaptation, I'd lost something essential. The woman who had raised Trevor to believe he could accomplish anything, who had cheered louder than anyone else at his graduation, who had worked overtime for months to help him buy his first suit for job interviews, That woman had been deemed inadequate for his new life. The engagement party 18 months ago had been the final test of my transformation. Held at the Ashford family estate, it was an elegant affair with perfectly appointed tables, a string quartet, and guest lists that read like a who's who of Riverside City society. I'd worn a dress Vivien had helped me select, spoke only when spoken to, and smiled pleasantly through conversations about topics I knew nothing about. At the end of the evening, Constance had approached me with what I'd learned to recognize as her version of approval. "Helen, you handled yourself beautifully tonight. I think you're really beginning to understand what this family represents." This family. Not our family or the family Trevor was joining, but this family. The one that mattered, the one with standards I'd finally learned to meet. Trevor had hugged me that night with genuine affection. The first time in months he'd seemed truly comfortable with my presence at one of their events. "Thanks, Mom. Tonight was perfect." Perfect, because I'd successfully made myself invisible. Looking back now, sitting in that cathedral pew with my awkward corsage and my carefully practiced smile, I could trace the exact progression of how I'd gone from being Trevor's proud mother to being his social liability. It hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been deliberately cruel. It had been a gradual erosion, a slow transformation from someone who mattered to someone who needed to be managed. But Richard Beaumont's genuine warmth had reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten, that there was a time when people valued what I had to say, when my presence added something to a room rather than requiring careful management. The woman who had raised Trevor Carlyle to be the man he'd become hadn't just disappeared. She'd been buried under layers of social education and appropriate behavior. And as I watched my son stand at that altar, confident and successful and thoroughly ashamed of where he'd come from, I wondered when we'd both forgotten that the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities was the same woman they now considered an embarrassment to his success. The ceremony was beautiful, I had to admit. Trevor stood tall and confident as Vivien glided down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. The vows they'd written themselves spoke of partnership, adventure, and building a legacy together. Beautiful words, perfectly delivered, but I noticed Trevor never once looked in my direction during the entire service. After the ceremony, during the cocktail hour at the Riverside Country Club, the real work began. This was where my 18 months of social education would be put to the test, where every lesson Vivien had taught me about appropriate conversation and acceptable topics would determine whether I successfully blended into the background or became the source of those subtle winces I'd learned to recognize on Trevor's face. I positioned myself near the bar not because I particularly wanted a drink, but because it gave me something to do with my hands and a reason to smile politely at strangers without having to initiate conversation. The first test came within minutes. "You must be so proud of Trevor," said a woman in an emerald green dress that complemented her perfectly styled auburn hair. "I'm Caroline Westbrook. My husband works with Trevor at Meridian." "Yes, very proud," I replied, keeping my response brief and warm. I'd learned that elaborating on my pride often led to stories about Trevor's childhood that made people uncomfortable. Tales of food stamps and secondhand clothes and working multiple jobs weren't cocktail party material. "And what a lovely couple they make. Vivien is just radiant. Her mother tells me they're honeymooning in Tuscany. How romantic." I nodded and smiled. Tuscany. 2 weeks in Italy, staying at a villa that Constance had recommended and Richard had generously offered to pay for as a wedding gift. Trevor had mentioned it casually, as if 2 weeks in Europe was as normal as a weekend at the beach. I'd never been farther from Riverside City than a 3-day trip to Chicago for a library conference 5 years ago. "Have you been to Italy?" Caroline asked. "Not yet," I said, which was technically true and sounded more hopeful than no, and I probably never will. "Oh, you simply must go. Richard and Constance have a villa near Siena that they opened to family. I'm sure they'd be delighted to have you visit sometime." I smiled and nodded. knowing full well that whatever definition of family the Ashfords used, it didn't include me. I was Trevor's mother, which made me a necessity to be accommodated, not a relative to be welcomed. The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes. Caroline describing her recent trip to the French Riviera, mentioning restaurants in Manhattan that charged more for one meal than I spent on groceries in a week, casually referencing charitable boards and social clubs that existed in a universe parallel to mine. I smiled, nodded, and made appropriate sounds of interest while feeling myself shrink with each passing minute. When Caroline finally excused herself to find her husband, I felt both relief and exhaustion. One conversation down, an entire reception to go. "Helen, there you are!" Vivien appeared at my elbow, looking like a princess in her flowing white gown. "I wanted to make sure you're enjoying yourself. How are you holding up?" Holding up? As if attending my son's wedding reception was an endurance test rather than a celebration. "Everything is beautiful, sweetheart. You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you. Listen, I wanted to give you a heads up about dinner. We've seated you at table 6 with some of Daddy's business associates and their wives. They're lovely people, very down to earth. I thought you'd be more comfortable there than with some of the younger crowd." Down to earth. Translation: they were wealthy enough not to be threatened by my presence, established enough not to need to prove their superiority, and polite enough to include me in conversation without making it obvious they were doing charity work. "That's very thoughtful of you. Oh, and one more thing," Vivien's voice dropped slightly. "I hope you don't mind, but when people ask about Trevor's father, I've been telling them that your ex-husband lives overseas. It just simplifies things." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Simplifies things how? Well, you know how it is. Some people have very traditional ideas about family structures. And since David isn't here anyway and he hasn't been part of Trevor's life for so long, it just makes the story cleaner. Cleaner? My 22 years of single motherhood, my struggles to provide for Trevor while his father pursued his music career and sent sporadic child support checks, my sacrifices to ensure Trevor never felt abandoned. All of that had been reduced to a story that needed to be cleaned up for public consumption. "I see. You're not upset, are you? It's just easier than explaining the whole complicated situation. People don't need to know all the details." The complicated situation. My life had been reduced to a complication that required management. "Of course not," I said, because what else could I say? That I was proud of raising Trevor alone? That I wanted credit for the sacrifices I'd made? That I resented having my story edited for the comfort of strangers? Wonderful, now I should go find Trevor. The photographer wants to do some family shots before dinner. Family shots. I waited to be included, but Vivien was already walking away, gathering her parents and grandparents for photos that would commemorate this perfect day. I stood by the bar watching my son pose with his new family, and realized I wasn't invited to be part of the official record. The evening continued with a series of small humiliations disguised as kindnesses. At dinner, I was indeed seated with Richard's business associates, kind, older couples who included me in their conversations with the gentle courtesy of people accustomed to managing social awkwardness. They asked polite questions about my work at the library, complimented my dress, and shared mild anecdotes about their own adult children. But I noticed the careful way they avoided asking about my background, my family, my life, before Trevor. I noticed how quickly they changed the subject when I mentioned anything that hinted at financial struggle or single parenthood. I noticed how they smiled and nodded when I spoke, but never built on my comments or asked follow-up questions the way they did with each other. During the speeches, Trevor's best man told charming stories about their college adventures and early career triumphs. Vivien's maid of honor spoke eloquently about friendship and love and bright futures. Richard offered a touching tribute to his daughter and warm welcome to his new son-in-law. Trevor's speech was polished, grateful, and conspicuously absent of any mention of his mother. He thanked Vivien's family for welcoming him, praised his new wife's beauty and intelligence, and spoke movingly about the future they would build together. He thanked his groomsmen, his colleagues, even the wedding coordinator. But the woman who had worked double shifts to pay for his college textbooks, who had attended every soccer game and graduation ceremony, who had believed in him when no one else knew his name, she remained invisible in his moment of triumph. I applauded with everyone else, smiled until my cheeks ached, and told myself this was normal. Weddings were about the couple, about looking forward, not backward. There was no reason for Trevor to mention his mother in a speech to 300 people who already knew I existed. But the omission stung anyway, especially when I saw how Constance glowed with pride when Richard spoke about the strong values and beautiful example she'd provided for their daughter. The contrast was stark and painful. Vivien's mother was celebrated as the foundation of her daughter's character, while I had been erased from the story of Trevor's success. After dinner, during the dancing, I found myself increasingly isolated. The younger guests were Trevor and Vivien's friends from college and work, sophisticated 20-somethings who spoke casually about international travel and investment portfolios. The older guests were family friends and business associates of the Ashfords, people who'd known each other for decades and shared references to country clubs and charitable organizations I'd never heard of. I danced once, with Richard, who was gracious and kind enough to seek me out during a slow song. But even that gesture felt like charity, the father of the bride ensuring that no one could say they'd neglected the groom's mother. "You've done a beautiful job raising Trevor," he said as we swayed to the music. "You should be very proud of the man he's become." "Thank you. That means a lot. I hope we'll see more of you now that we're family. Constance and I would love to have you join us for dinner sometime." It was a lovely gesture, sincerely offered, but I heard the subtext. They would include me because it was the right thing to do, not because they genuinely desired my company. I would be the obligation that came with their wonderful new son-in-law, the package deal they would graciously accept. As the evening wound down, I realized I had successfully navigated the entire reception without embarrassing Trevor. I had worn the right dress, spoken to the right people, told the right stories, and avoided the wrong topics. I had been appropriate, acceptable, and utterly forgettable. The cost of that success was becoming clear. I had spent 3 years learning to minimize myself, to edit my stories, to hide my struggles, to downplay my achievements. I had allowed my son and his new family to reshape my identity until I fit comfortably into their world, which meant I no longer fit comfortably into my own. I had gained their acceptance by losing myself, and as I watched Trevor dance with his beautiful new wife, surrounded by their beautiful new life, I wondered if the trade had been worth it. The weeks following the wedding, I threw myself into what I convinced myself was a mission of improvement. If Trevor was embarrassed by who I was, then I would become someone he could be proud of. If I didn't fit into his new world, then I would learn to fit. I had successfully navigated the wedding reception without causing any obvious disasters. Surely that proved I could adapt further. I started with my appearance, using money I'd been saving for a new roof repair. I booked an appointment at Vivien's salon, a sleek establishment in downtown Riverside City called Serenity. The prices made my stomach clench, but I reminded myself this was an investment in my relationship with my son. "I'd like a complete makeover," I told the stylist, a young woman named Madison with platinum blonde hair and perfect makeup. "Something more sophisticated." Madison studied my reflection with the critical eye of someone paid to find flaws. "Okay, honey, I can work with this. Your hair has great potential, but we need to modernize the cut and add some dimension. And we definitely need to do something about this color. It's very natural." Natural. The way she said it made it sound like a disease. 3 hours and $400 later, I emerged with blonde highlights, a sleek bob, and a face full of makeup that the esthetician had applied while explaining the importance of age-appropriate glamour. I looked like a different person. Polished, expensive, completely unlike myself. Trevor's reaction, when I showed up for Sunday dinner the following week, was everything I'd hoped for. "Mom, wow, you look really nice, different." Vivien recommended the salon. I thought it was time for a change. "It's great, very current." He seemed genuinely pleased, and for the first time in months, I felt like I'd done something right. Encouraged by this success, I embarked on a complete wardrobe overhaul. Vivien had given me a list of investment pieces that every woman should own: a good blazer, quality handbags, shoes that made a statement. I spent Saturday afternoons at department stores I'd previously only walked through on my way to somewhere else, learning the difference between designer labels and their more affordable imitators. The salespeople were helpful in the way that people are when they sense a commission opportunity. They taught me about seasonal colors, the importance of proper undergarments, and how accessories could elevate even simple outfits. I bought scarves that cost more than I'd ever spent on an entire outfit, learned to navigate the world of designer handbags, and discovered that there was apparently a significant difference between drugstore makeup and department store cosmetics. Within 2 months, I'd transformed my appearance completely. The woman in my mirror looked like she could attend charity luncheons and country club events without drawing concerned glances from wedding coordinators. I'd learned to contour my cheekbones, select wine by more than just price, and discuss current events in ways that revealed cultural literacy without betraying political opinions. The next test came when Constance invited me to join her book club. "We meet monthly at the club," she explained during a phone call that felt more like an interview than an invitation. "It's a lovely group of women, very intellectual. This month we're discussing The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. Have you read it?" I had read it, actually, and enjoyed it immensely. But when I mentioned this at the book club meeting, I quickly realized that enjoying a book and discussing it appropriately were 2 different skills entirely. "I found the narrative structure quite ambitious," said a woman named Beatrice, whose silver hair was arranged in a perfect chignon. "The way Reed uses the framing device of the interview to reveal character development was really quite sophisticated." I nodded thoughtfully, though I'd simply enjoyed the story without analyzing its literary techniques. When someone asked for my opinion, I offered, "I thought it was a fascinating look at how people create their public personas versus their private selves." The comment landed well enough, but I noticed how the other women built on each other's observations, with references to other authors, literary movements, and academic theories I'd never encountered. They discussed books the way art critics discussed paintings, with a vocabulary and framework I didn't possess despite my love of reading. After the meeting, Constance walked me to my car. "You did well today, Helen. I think you'll find your footing with this group. They can be a bit intimidating at first. Most of them have graduate degrees in literature or related fields, but they're very welcoming once you get to know them." Graduate degrees. Of course. I had a bachelor's degree in English from the State University, earned part-time over 6 years while working full-time and raising Trevor. But apparently that wasn't quite the same credential level as these women who'd attended elite universities and had the luxury of studying literature without worrying about paying rent. I continued attending the book club meetings, spending my evenings researching literary criticism online so I could contribute more meaningfully to discussions. I learned to pepper my comments with references to themes and motifs, to analyze character arcs and narrative devices. It wasn't entirely unenjoyable, but it felt like performing rather than sharing genuine reactions to books I'd read. The social calendar began to fill up. Constance included me in her charity work, inviting me to volunteer at fundraising events for the Riverside City Arts Foundation. I learned to write thank you notes on proper stationery, to arrange flowers for centerpieces, and to manage silent auction tables with the kind of gracious efficiency that made donors feel appreciated without being pressured. "You're becoming quite the asset," Constance told me after a particularly successful gala. "I had no idea you had such organizational skills." I'd been organizing library events and community programs for years, but apparently those skills only counted when applied to causes that mattered to the right people. Trevor began including me in more family gatherings. Sunday dinners became more frequent, and I was occasionally invited to join them for dinner with their friends. The conversations were easier, now that I'd learned the social vocabulary. Now that I could discuss books and charities and cultural events with something approaching competence. "You seem happier lately," Trevor observed one evening as we walked to our cars after dinner at an upscale restaurant in Willowbrook. "More engaged." "I'm enjoying getting involved in new things," I said, which was partially true. There was satisfaction in mastering new skills, in feeling less like an outsider in social situations. "Good. I think this has been really good for you, Mom. You seem more confident." Confident. I suppose I did seem more confident. If confidence could be measured by one's ability to navigate conversations about wine pairings and discuss novels in terms of literary merit rather than simple enjoyment. But underneath the polished exterior, I felt increasingly disconnected from the woman I'd been. The most successful attempt at fitting in came when Richard invited me to join a volunteer board for a literacy program that provided books to underserved schools. Finally, I thought, an area where my professional experience would be genuinely valuable rather than something to be overlooked. "Your background in library science will be incredibly helpful," Richard explained during our first board meeting. "We need someone who understands how to select age-appropriate materials and work within budget constraints." For the first time in months, I felt genuinely useful. I threw myself into the work, developing reading lists, researching publishers, and creating systems for tracking book distributions. The other board members, a mix of retired educators, wealthy philanthropists, and community leaders, actually sought out my opinions and implemented my suggestions. "Helen has been invaluable," Richard announced at a board dinner 6 months later. "Her expertise has helped us triple our book distribution while staying within budget. We're lucky to have her." I glowed under the praise, feeling for the first time since Trevor's engagement that my knowledge and experience were being recognized rather than minimized. Trevor, who attended the dinner as Richard's guest, seemed genuinely proud of my work. "I had no idea you were so good at this kind of thing," he said afterward. The comment stung slightly. I'd been good at this kind of thing for my entire career, but it had never seemed important enough to merit his attention until it was connected to Richard's organization. But I pushed aside the hurt feelings and focused on the positive. I was succeeding. I was becoming the kind of woman who belonged in Trevor's world, who could contribute meaningfully to important causes, who could hold her own in sophisticated conversations. For almost a year, this new version of myself seemed to work. I attended charity galas and book club meetings, volunteered for worthy causes, and maintained the kind of polished appearance that photographed well at social events. Trevor seemed more relaxed around me, more willing to include me in his life. But late at night, alone in my duplex that I'd redecorated to reflect my more sophisticated tastes, I sometimes caught glimpses of my old self in unexpected places. A worn paperback romance novel hidden behind the literary fiction I now displayed prominently. A photo of Trevor and me at a pizza place when he was 12, both of us laughing with sauce-stained faces. A ceramic mug he'd made in elementary school art class, too chipped and homely for my newly refined kitchen, but too precious to throw away. These artifacts of my former life felt like evidence of a crime I was trying to cover up. But I told myself that growth required leaving old things behind, that becoming someone worthy of Trevor's pride meant shedding the parts of myself that had embarrassed him. I was working so hard to become the mother he deserved that I'd almost forgotten to ask whether the mother I'd been was the one he'd actually needed. The crack in my carefully constructed facade began on a Tuesday evening in March, during what should have been a routine dinner at Trevor and Vivien's new house in Elmwood Estates. They'd bought the colonial-style home 6 months after the wedding. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a kitchen that cost more than I'd paid for my duplex. It was beautiful, professionally decorated, and felt as welcoming as a museum exhibit. I'd arrived with a bottle of wine from the approved list Vivien had texted me. Apparently, my previous selections had been a bit too sweet for sophisticated palates, and wearing the navy blazer and pearl earrings that had become my uniform for family gatherings. I'd learned to dress like Trevor's mother was supposed to dress, speak like she was supposed to speak, and respond like she was supposed to respond. But that evening, something was different. Maybe it was the way Vivien greeted me at the door with her perfected hostess smile, the kind reserved for guests rather than family. Maybe it was how Trevor barely looked up from his phone when I entered the living room. Or maybe it was the conversation that followed dinner, when they announced their latest news. "We have something exciting to share," Vivien said as she served dessert. Individual chocolate soufflés that looked like they belonged in a restaurant. "Trevor's been offered a position with Ashford Development Group." I looked at Trevor, expecting to see excitement, but his expression was carefully neutral. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Tell me more about it." "It's a senior associate position," Trevor explained, his tone suggesting he was reciting information rather than sharing good news. "I'd be working directly with Richard on some major commercial projects. It's a significant step up from Meridian. And the best part," Vivien added, "is that it comes with relocation assistance. The position is based out of their Atlanta office." Atlanta. The word hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. "Atlanta," I repeated slowly. "That's quite far." "About 8 hours by car," Trevor said, still not meeting my eyes. "But it's an incredible opportunity, the kind of position I've been working toward my entire career." I set down my fork, the soufflé suddenly tasteless. "When would you start?" "We're thinking June," Vivien said. "That gives us time to sell the house and find something lovely in Atlanta. Daddy knows some wonderful neighborhoods there." Of course he did. Richard Beaumont seemed to know wonderful people in wonderful places wherever his children needed to establish themselves. "That's very exciting," I said, because it was what they expected me to say. "You must be thrilled." "We are," Vivien beamed. "It feels like the next chapter in our adventure." Their adventure. I noticed how naturally she excluded me from their future, how easily the conversation moved to discussions of neighborhoods I'd never see, schools for children I might never know, and career opportunities that would take my son 800 miles away from anything that had ever mattered to me. I smiled and nodded through the rest of the evening, asking appropriate questions about their timeline and expressing enthusiasm I didn't feel. When Trevor walked me to my car that night, I waited for him to acknowledge what this move meant for us, for our relationship, for the Sunday dinners and holiday traditions we'd maintained despite all the changes. Instead, he said, "I'm glad you're taking this so well, Mom. I was worried you might be upset." Upset. As if my feelings about my only child moving to another state were an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a legitimate response to be considered. "I want what's best for you," I said, which was true, even though I wasn't sure this qualified. "I know you do, and who knows, maybe this'll be good for you too. You've been building such a nice life here with your volunteer work and your book club. You won't have to worry about us anymore." Won't have to worry about us anymore. The words echoed in my head during the drive home, during the sleepless hours that followed, and through the days that came after. When had caring about my son become something he needed to free me from? The weeks that followed brought a series of small revelations that accumulated like water droplets before a flood. I began to notice things I'd trained myself to overlook, to hear undertones I'd taught myself to ignore. At the book club meeting the following week, I found myself really listening to the conversation for the first time in months. We were discussing Educated by Tara Westover, and the women around the table were dissecting the author's journey away from her family, with a mixture of admiration and subtle condescension. "Of course it's tragic when families can't evolve together," said Beatrice, adjusting her reading glasses. "But sometimes growth requires leaving certain people behind." "Exactly," agreed another member, Patricia Henley. "You can't let family loyalty hold you back from becoming who you're meant to be." The words struck me like a physical blow, Were they talking about Tara Westover's abusive family situation, or were they talking about me? About mothers who didn't fit into their children's elevated circumstances, who required management and careful handling to avoid embarrassment. I excused myself early that evening, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The following Sunday, I declined Trevor and Vivien's dinner invitation for the first time in over a year. Instead, I drove to the old neighborhood where Trevor and I had lived when he was in elementary school. The duplex we'd rented then had been torn down and replaced with a small shopping center, but I sat in my car anyway, remembering. I remembered Trevor at 8 years old, helping me plant tomatoes in the tiny backyard garden. I remembered him at 12, proudly wearing the sweater I'd knitted him to school picture day even though it was slightly lopsided. I remembered him at 16, working his first job at the grocery store and bringing home his paycheck with such pride, insisting on contributing to our groceries. That boy had loved me unconditionally, had been proud of our small apartment and our thrift store furniture and our Friday night tradition of pizza and old movies. When had he learned to be ashamed of those things? When had I learned to be ashamed of them too? The next crack came during a charity event for the Literacy Foundation. I'd been working with Richard's organization for over a year now, and I genuinely enjoyed the work. But that evening, as I helped arrange silent auction items, I overheard a conversation between two other board members. "Have you met Richard's new daughter-in-law's mother, Helen something?" "Oh yes, lovely woman, so dedicated to the cause." Richard says she's been quite helpful. Amazing how she's adapted, considering her background." "What do you mean?" "Well, you know, working class. Trevor really married up, didn't he? But she's done well with the social education. You'd hardly know where she came from now." Social education. The phrase hit me like ice water. They were discussing my transformation, as if it were a project they'd all been invested in, a charity case that had worked out better than expected. I continued arranging auction items with steady hands while my mind reeled. Was this how they all saw me? As someone who had been successfully rehabilitated from my embarrassing origins? Was my value measured only by how completely I'd erased the woman I used to be? That night, I did something I hadn't done in almost 2 years. I went to my bedroom and pulled out the box of photo albums I'd hidden in my closet after redecorating with more sophisticated items. I spent hours looking at pictures of Trevor and me through the years, camping trips we'd taken in our secondhand tent, birthday parties in our small kitchen, graduation ceremonies where I'd been the loudest person cheering in the audience. In every photo I looked happy, genuinely unself-consciously happy. But more than that, Trevor looked happy too. He looked like a boy who was loved, who belonged somewhere, who knew exactly where he came from and was proud of it. When had that changed? When had the mother who had been enough for him for 25 years suddenly become insufficient? And why had I agreed that she needed to disappear? I closed the photo albums and sat in the darkness of my bedroom, finally asking myself the questions I'd been avoiding for months. What if this wasn't temporary? What if Trevor's move to Atlanta wasn't just about career advancement, but about putting even more distance between himself and his origins? What if all my efforts to become someone worthy of his world had only confirmed his belief that the mother he'd started with wasn't good enough? And most dangerously of all, what if the woman I'd been before, the one who had raised him with love and sacrifice and unwavering belief in his potential, had been exactly the mother he'd needed, and the woman I'd become was just a more palatable version of her for people who had never bothered to look past surface appearances? For the first time in 2 years, I allowed myself to consider that maybe the problem wasn't that I hadn't changed enough. Maybe the problem was that I'd changed at all. The thought was terrifying, because it meant that everything I'd worked so hard to become might have been built on a foundation of shame that was never justified in the first place. It meant that in trying to earn my son's respect, I might have lost my own. I sat in my dark bedroom until dawn, finally admitting to myself that the woman staring back at me from my mirror each morning felt like a stranger. And for the first time in almost 2 years, I found myself missing the woman she used to be. The revelation came on a Saturday afternoon in early April, in the most mundane way possible. I was cleaning out my email inbox, deleting promotional messages, and organizing digital receipts, when I noticed an email thread I'd been accidentally copied on. The subject line read, "Mom Situation Thoughts?" and the sender was Trevor's personal email address. I almost deleted it immediately, assuming it was some kind of mistake or spam that had somehow spoofed his account. But something made me hesitate. The timestamp showed it had been sent 3 days earlier, on the Wednesday evening after I declined their dinner invitation. Curiosity overrode my better judgment, and I clicked to open it. The email was addressed to Vivien, and the first few lines made my blood turn cold. "V, I think we need to discuss the mom situation before we finalize the Atlanta move. She's been acting weird lately, and I'm worried she's going to become clingy or dramatic about us leaving. Last Sunday, she didn't even show up for dinner, which isn't like her at all. She's probably realizing that her little social project is about to end and she'll have to go back to her regular life." Her little social project. 24 months of transforming myself, of learning to speak their language, of volunteering for their causes and reading their books and wearing their clothes. All of it dismissed as a little social project. My hands shook as I scrolled down to read Vivien's response. "I know exactly what you mean. Mom mentioned that Helen seemed unsettled at the book club last week. Honestly, I think we've been enabling this whole thing too long. She's gotten too comfortable in our world, and now she probably thinks she belongs here permanently. The charity work, the makeover, all of it. We should have realized she'd get attached. As if my love for my son and my desire to be part of his life was some kind of unhealthy dependency, rather than the most natural thing in the world." Trevor's response was worse. "Exactly. Don't get me wrong, I'm grateful that she made an effort. It made everything easier when she learned to blend in. But I think she's confused about what this was. This was about helping her not embarrass us at social events, not about making her a permanent fixture in our circle. She's a librarian from Maplewood Heights. That's who she is. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's not who we are." I had to stop reading and steady myself against my kitchen counter. The room felt like it was tilting, reality shifting beneath my feet like an earthquake. I forced myself to continue. "The Atlanta move is actually perfect timing," Vivien had written back. "Natural transition. We can gradually phase out the social invitations. Let her volunteer commitments wind down. She'll find her own level again. And honestly, it'll probably be a relief for her too. All this charity work and cultural stuff, I always wondered if she was actually enjoying it or just felt obligated. 2 years of my life, thousands of dollars spent on clothes and salon appointments and book club selections, countless hours volunteering for causes I'd grown to genuinely care about. All of it seen as obligation rather than genuine growth or desire to be close to my son. But it was Trevor's final email in the thread that shattered me completely. "You're right, as always. I feel bad about it sometimes, but the truth is, I was embarrassed by her before. The way she dressed, the things she talked about, how excited she got about stuff that didn't matter. Remember that first dinner when she brought out my Little League trophies? I wanted to disappear. But now I'm not embarrassed anymore, and that was the point. She served her purpose. She learned to be appropriate. But you're right, that she can't think this is her new permanent identity. Atlanta will be good for everyone." I served my purpose. The words echoed in my head like a death knell. I had served my purpose, like a tool that had been useful for a specific job and could now be put away. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the computer screen, reading and rereading those words until they burned into my memory. She served her purpose. Not, she's my mother and I love her. Not, she made incredible sacrifices for me. Not, she deserves my respect and gratitude. She served her purpose. My phone rang, Trevor's name appearing on the screen. For a moment, I considered not answering, but muscle memory took over. "Hi, sweetheart." "Hey, Mom. Listen, I was calling because Vivien and I wanted to invite you to dinner Sunday. We thought we could talk more about the Atlanta move, maybe discuss some ideas for how to stay in touch once we're settled." His voice was warm, casual, completely normal. He had no idea I'd seen behind the curtain, that I knew exactly what he thought of me and my little social project. "That sounds lovely," I heard myself say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. "Great. Oh, and Mom? I was thinking maybe you could bring that photo album you showed Vivien when we first started dating, the one with all my childhood pictures." She was saying how fun it would be to look through it again. The photo album. The same album that had prompted his comment about wanting to disappear when I'd shown it off proudly 2 years ago. Now it was suddenly acceptable because it served a purpose, nostalgic entertainment for the couple before they moved on to their new life without me. "Of course," I said. "I'd be happy to bring it." "Perfect. See you Sunday at 6. After he hung up, I sat in my kitchen for what felt like hours, watching the afternoon light fade through my window. Everything I'd believed about the past 2 years had been a lie, not the facts. I had learned to dress better, speak more appropriately, navigate social situations with greater skill. But the meaning of it all, the purpose, the love I thought I was building, all of it had been an illusion. I hadn't been becoming someone worthy of Trevor's world. I had been learning to play a role that made his life easier. I hadn't been growing closer to my son. I'd been performing a version of motherhood that was palatable to his new family and social circle. The most devastating part was realizing how well it had worked. Trevor wasn't embarrassed by me anymore because I'd successfully erased everything about myself that had ever embarrassed him. But in doing so, I'd also erased everything that had made me, me. I thought about the woman in those hidden photo albums, the one who had raised Trevor with such fierce love and pride. She had worked multiple jobs to keep us afloat, had sewn Halloween costumes and packed creative lunches, and cheered at every school event like her presence mattered. She had been proud of her son's achievements because she knew how hard they'd both worked for them. That woman would never have diminished herself to make others comfortable. She would never have hidden her struggles or downplayed her sacrifices. She wouldn't have needed to earn her place in her son's life because she'd already earned it through 25 years of unwavering love and support. But I'd been convinced that woman wasn't good enough. I'd been convinced that love wasn't enough, that sacrifice wasn't enough, that being Trevor's mother wasn't enough, unless I could also be the kind of mother who looked right in family photos and didn't embarrass him at country club events. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out one of those hidden photo albums. There was a picture of Trevor at his high school graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. I was wearing a simple blue dress from JCPenney, my hair was unstyled, and my makeup was minimal. But I looked radiant, happy, proud. And Trevor, 18-year-old Trevor, looked genuinely happy too. He wasn't performing happiness or managing embarrassment. He was celebrating with his mother, the woman who had made that moment possible. When had that stopped being enough? I closed the album and looked at myself in the bedroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was polished, appropriate, socially acceptable. Her clothes were expensive, her hair was professionally styled, her makeup was applied with expert precision. But her eyes looked empty. I had spent 2 years becoming someone else, someone better, someone worthy of Trevor's new life. But the truth was crushing. He didn't want me in his new life at all. He wanted me to stay in my proper place, grateful for the temporary inclusion, understanding that it had been charity rather than genuine acceptance. I had served my purpose. Now it was time to return to my regularly scheduled life, armed with better fashion sense and improved conversation skills, but fundamentally alone in the way I'd always been alone. Only now I couldn't even recognize the woman in the mirror. The crack that had started with doubts and questions had split wide open into a chasm of understanding. I hadn't been building a relationship with my son. I had been auditioning for a role I was never going to get, learning lines for a play I was never meant to star in. And tomorrow, I was supposed to sit at their dinner table, bring that photo album, and pretend I didn't know that every smile, every kindness, every moment of inclusion had been carefully calculated to manage me rather than love me. The question that had been building for weeks finally crystallized into perfect, terrible clarity. What if none of this had ever been about love at all? I didn't cry. I expected to, sitting there in my kitchen with the truth spreading through me like poison. But the tears never came. Instead, something else settled into place. A clarity so sharp and cold, it felt like breathing pure oxygen for the first time in years. I closed the laptop and walked through my duplex, seeing it with new eyes. The living room I'd redecorated to look more sophisticated, the books I'd displayed to seem more intellectual, the expensive throw pillows that matched nothing I actually liked. Every corner had been curated to reflect the woman I thought I needed to become, but none of it reflected the woman I actually was. In my bedroom, I opened the closet and stared at the wardrobe I'd assembled over the past 2 years. Blazers in neutral tones, silk scarves, tailored pants that required dry cleaning, professional pieces that whispered rather than spoke, that blended rather than stood out. Clothes for a woman who had learned to make herself small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. But it was the jewelry box that stopped me cold. There, buried beneath the pearls and conservative gold pieces I'd accumulated, was a silver bracelet with small charms, a book, a graduation cap, a tiny house. Trevor had given it to me for Mother's Day when he was 14, saving his lawn mowing money for weeks to buy it. Each charm represented something important in our shared history. I hadn't worn it in over a year. It wasn't sophisticated enough for charity galas or book club meetings. But holding it now, I remembered the boy who had chosen each charm carefully, who had been proud to give his mother something that celebrated who she was rather than who she should become. That night, I made a list, not a to-do list or a grocery list, but something I'd never done before. A list of who I actually was beneath all the careful construction of the past 2 years. Helen Carlisle, I wrote at the top of the page. Then I began. Single mother who raised a successful son while working 2 jobs. Librarian who has helped hundreds of children discover the joy of reading. Woman who can make a 3-course meal from whatever's in the pantry. Person who cries at commercials with dogs and laughs too loudly at movies. Someone who believes in second chances and the power of education. Mother who has loved unconditionally for 28 years. The list grew longer as the night wore on. Each item felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I'd abandoned. I was someone who preferred romance novels to literary fiction, who bought generic brand groceries without shame, who had survived divorce and single parenthood and financial struggles with grace and humor. I was someone who had built a good life from very little, who had raised a kind and successful man, who had contributed to her community in meaningful ways. None of that had been diminished by Trevor's embarrassment, none of that had been inadequate, until I'd been convinced it was. Sunday morning, I made a decision that felt both impulsive and inevitable. Instead of spending hours getting ready for dinner at Trevor's house, I drove to my old neighborhood. Not the one where we'd lived when he was small, but the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where my best friend Sarah still lived in the house she'd inherited from her parents. I hadn't seen Sarah in almost a year. She'd invited me to coffee several times, but I'd always had charity events or book club meetings or hair appointments. I had been too busy becoming someone else to maintain the friendship with someone who had known me when I was just myself. Sarah answered the door in paint-splattered jeans and an old sweater, her graying hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked exactly like herself, and I felt a sharp pang of envy. "Helen, what a wonderful surprise!" Her smile was genuine, warm. "Come in, come in!" I was just painting the bathroom. Probably not the most glamorous activity, but retirement has made me brave about home improvement projects. Her house looked exactly the same as it had 10 years ago. Comfortable furniture arranged for conversation rather than display, family photos clustered on every surface, books stacked on tables next to half-finished crossword puzzles. It felt like stepping into a warm hug. "You look," Sarah paused, studying my face. "Different. Are you okay?" The question almost undid me. When was the last time someone had asked if I was okay and waited for a real answer? "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "Can I tell you something?" We sat in her kitchen while I told her everything. About Trevor's engagement, about my transformation, about the charity work and book clubs and careful reinvention of myself, about the email I'd seen, and the devastating realization of how my son really viewed me. Sarah listened without interrupting, occasionally refilling my coffee cup, her expression growing more concerned as the story unfolded. "So let me get this straight," she said when I finished. "You spent 2 years changing everything about yourself to fit into your son's new world, and now you've discovered that he never wanted you to fit in. He just wanted you to stop embarrassing him?" Put that way, it sounded even worse. Essentially, yes. "And you're supposed to go to dinner tonight and pretend you don't know any of this?" I don't know what else to do. Sarah set down her coffee cup and leaned forward. "Helen, honey, do you remember when we were in high school and you found out that Brad Morrison had only asked you to prom because his friends bet him he couldn't get a date with someone from the wrong side of town?" I remembered. The humiliation had been crushing. "Do you remember what you did?" I told him exactly what I thought of him and his friends, and then I went to prom with Danny Chen and had the best time of my life. Exactly. You didn't pretend you hadn't heard the truth. You didn't try to prove you were worthy of Brad's attention. You recognized that the problem wasn't with you. It was with people who thought where you came from determined your worth. The parallel was uncomfortable but accurate. This is different. Trevor is my son. Is he? Sarah's question was gentle but pointed. Because the Trevor you've described to me doesn't sound like the boy who used to help you in the garden, who brought home every stray animal in the neighborhood, who called you his hero in his high school graduation speech. I thought about that speech, about 18-year-old Trevor thanking me for showing him that love and hard work could overcome any obstacle. When had he stopped believing that? What if he's become someone I don't recognize? I asked. Then you have to decide who you want to be in response to that. I spent the afternoon at Sarah's house, helping her paint the bathroom and talking about everything except Trevor and Vivien and charity galas. We talked about books we'd read, places we wanted to travel, the satisfaction of watching tomatoes grow in a garden you'd planted yourself. Normal conversation between friends who liked each other without conditions or expectations. When it was time to leave for dinner, I felt calmer, but also more resolved. I would go to Trevor's house tonight, but not as the woman who had been performing appropriateness for his approval. I would go as myself, the real Helen Carlisle, the one who had earned her place in her son's life through 28 years of love and sacrifice. I drove home and changed clothes, putting away the conservative blouse and tailored pants I'd planned to wear. Instead, I chose a blue sweater Trevor had complimented years ago, jeans that fit comfortably, and the silver charm bracelet he'd given me when he was 14. I did my makeup the way I preferred it, not the professional application I'd learned at the department store counter, but the simple routine that made me feel like myself. I pulled my hair back in a simple ponytail and looked in the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't polished or sophisticated or socially appropriate, but she looked real. She looked like someone who belonged in her own life. I picked up the photo album Trevor had requested, but as I was about to leave, I made one more decision. I went to my computer and printed out the email thread I'd accidentally received. I folded it carefully and put it in my purse. Tonight, I would not pretend I didn't know the truth. Tonight, I would not perform gratitude for crumbs of inclusion. Tonight, I would remember that I was someone who deserved to be loved for who I was, not praised for who I'd learned to pretend to be. I was going to dinner as Helen Carlyle, not the improved version, not the socially acceptable version, but the original version. The one who had raised Trevor Carlyle to be the man he was, even if he'd forgotten to be grateful for her. The woman who had served her purpose, as he'd put it. But my purpose hadn't been to disappear gracefully, when I was no longer needed. My purpose had been to love him unconditionally, and that had never included teaching him that love was conditional on social acceptability. It was time to remind my son who his mother really was. And if he couldn't love that woman, then perhaps it was time to stop trying to earn love from someone who had confused it with performance. I arrived at Trevor and Vivien's house at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying the photo album in one hand and my purse containing the printed emails in the other. For the first time in 2 years, I hadn't rehearsed conversation topics during the drive over. I hadn't practiced appropriate responses or planned safe anecdotes. I was simply going to be myself and see what happened. Vivien answered the door with her usual bright smile, but I caught the slight falter when she took in my appearance. The blue sweater, the comfortable jeans, the silver charm bracelet catching the light. This wasn't the carefully curated version of myself she'd grown accustomed to. "Helen, you look nice, very casual." "Thank you. I thought I'd be comfortable tonight." Trevor appeared behind her, and I watched his expression shift through the same sequence. Initial welcome, then confusion, then that familiar tension around his eyes that I'd learned to dread. But this time, instead of feeling shame, I felt something closer to pity. How exhausting it must be to constantly monitor other people's appearances for potential embarrassment. "Hey, Mom, you brought the album?" "I did." I held it up, noting how his gaze lingered on my bracelet. I wondered if he remembered giving it to me, or if it just registered as another item that didn't meet current standards. Dinner started normally enough. Vivien had prepared salmon with quinoa and roasted vegetables, the kind of meal that photographed well and demonstrated sophisticated palates. The conversation flowed through safe topics: the weather, their house hunting progress in Atlanta, updates on mutual acquaintances from their social circle. But I could feel them watching me, waiting for some misstep that would confirm their private conversations about my inability to maintain their standards without constant guidance. When I complimented the meal genuinely rather than analyzing its culinary techniques, when I mentioned enjoying a mystery novel I'd picked up at the library instead of discussing the latest book club selection, when I laughed too loudly at something that amused me, each natural response seemed to register as a small disappointment. "So, Mom," Trevor said as Vivien served dessert, "we wanted to talk about staying in touch once we move. We're thinking regular video calls, maybe monthly visits when our schedules allow." Monthly visits when their schedules allowed. Not because they missed me or wanted to maintain our relationship, but when it was convenient for them. "That sounds reasonable," I said calmly. "And of course, you'll always be welcome in Atlanta, but we thought it might be good to give you some advance notice for visits. The guest room is quite small, and we're hoping to entertain a lot once we're settled." I would be welcome in Atlanta with advance notice, in a small guest room, when they weren't entertaining people who mattered more than I did. I understand. Vivien leaned forward with what I'd learned to recognize as her concerned face. "We just want to make sure you have realistic expectations, you know? Atlanta will be a fresh start for us, a chance to really establish ourselves. We want to make sure you have plenty to keep you busy here so you don't feel left out." Left out. The euphemism was almost insulting in its transparency. "Actually," I said, setting down my dessert fork, "I wanted to talk to you both about expectations too." Something in my tone made them both sit up straighter. Trevor's eyes narrowed slightly, the way they did when he sensed a situation that might require management. "Oh?" Vivien's smile became more fixed. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded emails, placing them on the table between us. "I was accidentally copied on your email thread about the mom situation. I thought we should discuss it openly rather than continuing to pretend." The color drained from Trevor's face. Vivien looked confused for a moment before understanding dawned, and her expression shifted to something like panic. Mom, I can explain. Please don't. My voice was steady, calm. I've read it all. The part about my little social project. The discussion of how I've gotten too attached to your world. The relief that Atlanta will provide a natural transition away from including me. Trevor's comment about how I served my purpose. The silence that followed was deafening. Trevor opened and closed his mouth several times, while Vivien stared at the papers as if they might burst into flames. Those emails, they were taken out of context, Trevor finally managed. Were they? Because they seemed quite clear to me. 2 years ago, you were embarrassed by your mother. So I changed everything about myself to stop embarrassing you. And now that I've learned to be appropriately invisible, you're ready to phase me out entirely. That's not... Mom, you're being dramatic. Am I? I opened the photo album I'd brought and turned it to a picture of Trevor's high school graduation. This is your graduation speech. Do you remember what you said about me that day? Trevor glanced at the photo, his jaw tightening. That was different. I was 18. You were 18 when you called me your hero. You said I'd shown you that love and hard work could overcome any obstacle. You said you were proud to be Helen Carlisle's son. I turned the page to another photo. Trevor helping me in the garden when he was 12. This is the boy who used to brag to his friends that his mom could fix anything and make the best chocolate chip cookies in the neighborhood. People change, Mom. I grew up. Yes, you did. You grew up to be ashamed of the woman who raised you, but the interesting thing is, I grew up too. I grew up enough to realize that the problem was never with me. Vivien finally found her voice. Helen, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Has there? Because in your email you wrote that I should find my quote, own level again. What level is that exactly? The level of a woman who worked 2 jobs to put her son through college. The level of someone who volunteered at his school and cheered at his games and believed in him when no one else knew his name. You're twisting this, Trevor said, his voice rising. We tried to help you. We included you in things. We introduced you to people who could broaden your horizons. You mean you managed me, you trained me to be an acceptable version of myself for your convenience. There's a difference. I stood up and walked to their mantelpiece, where they displayed photos from their wedding, their honeymoon, their various social events. Not one picture included me. You know what I realized today? I spent 2 years trying to become someone worthy of your love, but the woman I was before was already worthy. She always had been. The only people who couldn't see that were the ones who had learned to measure worth by bank accounts and zip codes, and whether someone knew which fork to use for salad. This is ridiculous, Trevor snapped. You're acting like we committed some terrible crime by helping you improve yourself. Improve myself? I turned back to face him. Into what? Someone who hides her accomplishments? Someone who apologizes for her background? Someone who's grateful for scraps of inclusion in her own son's life? Someone who wouldn't embarrass us, Trevor said, and immediately looked like he wished he could take the words back. But I smiled. There it is. The truth we've been dancing around for 2 years. You were embarrassed by me. The woman who raised you to be everything you are today wasn't good enough for the life you wanted to live. Mom, let me finish. I want you to understand something very clearly. I am not embarrassed by who I am. I am not ashamed of how you grew up. I am not apologetic for the sacrifices I made or the life I built for us. The woman who couldn't afford designer clothes but made sure you had everything you needed? I'm proud of her. The woman who worked overtime to pay for your college while you slept safely in a warm bed every night? She was magnificent. Vivien was crying now, but I wasn't sure if it was from guilt or frustration at having their carefully managed situation explode. I don't want monthly video calls or advance notice visits or small guest rooms when you're not entertaining more important people. I don't want to be the family obligation you check off your list or the embarrassing origin story you have to explain to your sophisticated friends. I picked up my purse and the photo album. I want a son who loves his mother enough to be proud of her. And if you can't be that son, then I need to stop trying to be the mother you think you deserve and start being the mother I've always been. Someone who knows her worth doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. Trevor stood up, his face flushed. You're overreacting. You're going to ruin everything over some private emails that you weren't even supposed to see. I'm not ruining anything, sweetheart. I'm just stopping my participation in something that was never real to begin with. I walked toward the door, then turned back one last time. For what it's worth, the boy I raised would never have been embarrassed by the woman who loved him unconditionally. If you can find him again, he's welcome to call me. But this version of you, the one who measures love by social acceptability, I don't think we have anything left to say to each other. I left their house and drove home through the quiet streets of Maplewood Heights, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not because the confrontation had gone well, but because I had finally stopped pretending that love should require me to disappear. The woman who had raised Trevor Carlisle deserved better than what I'd been accepting, and for the first time in 2 years I was ready to give her what she deserved. The phone started ringing at 7:30 the next morning. Trevor's name flashed on the screen, but I let it go to voicemail. It rang again 10 minutes later, then again 20 minutes after that. By noon, I had 12 missed calls and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. Mom, we need to talk. You misunderstood everything. Please call me back. Vivien is upset, and I think we can work this out. You're being unreasonable. Those emails didn't mean what you think they meant. I turned off my phone and spent the morning in my garden, planting the tomatoes I'd bought weeks ago but hadn't had time to properly tend. The simple act of digging in the soil, of nurturing something real and growing, felt like meditation after 2 years of carefully orchestrated social interactions. Around 2 o'clock there was a knock at my door. Through the peephole I could see Richard Beaumont standing on my porch, looking concerned but not angry. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. Richard, this is unexpected. Hello, Helen. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to talk to you about what happened last night. I invited him in, curious about what version of events he'd been told. Richard had always been kind to me, but his loyalty would naturally lie with his daughter and son-in-law. Trevor called me this morning, he said as we sat in my living room. He was quite upset. He said you'd had some kind of misunderstanding about private emails. There was no misunderstanding. I accidentally received emails where Trevor and Vivien discussed me as a problem to be managed. The conversation was very clear about their feelings. Richard studied my face carefully. May I ask what they said? I considered how much to share, then decided on honesty. They referred to my efforts to fit into your social circle as a little social project that I'd gotten too attached to. Trevor said I had, quote, served my purpose in learning not to embarrass him, and they were relieved that the Atlanta move would provide a natural way to phase me out of their lives. Richard was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. I see. And how did you respond? I confronted them directly. I told them I wasn't interested in being managed or tolerated, and that if Trevor couldn't love me as I am, then we don't have much of a relationship left. Good for you. The response surprised me. I'm sorry? Good for you, Richard repeated. Helen, I've watched you transform yourself over the past 2 years, and while I admired your effort to fit in with our social circle, I always wondered if it was making you happy. I stared at him. I assumed you approved of the changes. I approved of your dedication to the Literacy Foundation and your contributions to our community work. Those were genuine, but the rest of it, he shook his head. You became very polished, very appropriate, but you also became very quiet. The woman who used to light up when talking about a book she'd recommended to a library patron, who told stories about Trevor's childhood with such obvious love and pride, she seemed to disappear. Trevor was embarrassed by those stories. Then Trevor was a fool. The blunt assessment hung in the air between us. Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. Helen, may I tell you something? When Vivien first brought Trevor home, Constance and I were concerned. Not because of his background, we couldn't care less about that, but because he seemed almost ashamed of where he came from. Young men who are embarrassed by their origins often turn into adults who are embarrassed by anything that doesn't serve their image. You were concerned about Trevor? We were concerned about what kind of man our daughter was falling in love with. A man who's ashamed of the woman who raised him, that tells you something about his character. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't realized was there. But you welcomed him into your family. We welcomed him because Vivien loved him, and because we believed people could grow. We hoped that love and acceptance might help him appreciate what he had rather than focus on what he thought he lacked. Richard paused. But I'm afraid our social circle may have reinforced his worst instincts instead. What do you mean? The people in our world, Helen, many of them have never had to struggle for anything meaningful. They mistake pedigree for character, assume that expensive education equals wisdom. When they met you, they should have seen a woman who'd accomplished something remarkable, raising a successful son under difficult circumstances. Instead, they saw someone who needed to be improved to fit their standards. And I let them improve me. You tried to love your son in the language you thought he wanted to hear. There's nothing wrong with that impulse. But the problem was never with you. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard spoke again. I need to tell you something else. After Trevor called me this morning, I called Constance. We had a long conversation about what's been happening with you and Trevor over the past 2 years. Oh, Constance feels terrible. She realizes now that in trying to help you navigate our social world, she may have inadvertently sent the message that who you were wasn't sufficient. That was never her intention. I'm not angry with Constance. She was trying to be kind. She was, but kindness without understanding can sometimes cause harm. We should have told you from the beginning that you were fine exactly as you were. We should have told Trevor that his mother was someone to be celebrated, not managed. Why are you telling me this? Richard smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, it wasn't the polite smile of social courtesy, but something warmer and more genuine. Because I'm hoping it's not too late to start over. The Literacy Foundation needs a new board chair, someone with real expertise and passion for the work. I'd like to offer you the position, if you're interested. I blinked in surprise. But I thought Margaret Hensley was going to take over when you stepped down. Margaret knows how to organize a fundraiser, but she doesn't know the first thing about literacy education. You do. More than that, you care about it in a way that can't be taught or faked. What about Trevor and Vivien? Won't this be awkward? Helen, if my son-in-law can't handle working alongside his mother on a charitable board because he's embarrassed by her professional expertise, then that says everything we need to know about him, doesn't it? Before I could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Constance, looking uncharacteristically subdued. Helen, I hope you don't mind. Richard told me he was coming to see you, and I owe you an apology. Over the next hour, sitting in my modest living room with these 2 pillars of Riverside City society, I heard something I'd never expected. A complete validation of my worth from the very people whose approval I'd been so desperately seeking. The truth is, Constance said, I was so focused on helping you feel comfortable in our world that I never stopped to consider whether our world deserved someone as genuine as you. We've been thinking about this all wrong, Richard added. Instead of asking how we could help you fit in, we should have been asking how we could create space for someone with your perspective and experience. They stayed for dinner, take-out Chinese food that I'd never have served during my appropriate phase, and we talked about books and community programs and the kind of work that actually mattered. For the first time in months, I felt like myself in my own home. As they were leaving, Richard handed me a business card. Think about the board position. We meet next Thursday evening. No pressure, but I think you'd bring exactly what we need. After they left, I sat on my couch with their words echoing in my mind. The very people I'd been trying so hard to impress had seen through my performance to the person underneath and decided she was worth knowing. My phone had 13 more missed calls from Trevor. I turned it back on and typed a single text message. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about who we both are, not who you think we should be, call me. But I won't be managing your comfort anymore. Then I put the phone away and went to bed, sleeping more peacefully than I had in months. The resolution wasn't what I'd expected. I'd thought I would have to choose between my son and my self-respect. Instead, I discovered that the people whose respect actually mattered had been waiting for me to respect myself enough to stop performing for their approval. Trevor still had to choose what kind of man he wanted to be, but I'd already chosen what kind of woman I was going to remain. 6 months later, I stood at the podium of the Riverside City Community Center, looking out at an audience of parents, teachers, and local officials gathered for the annual Literacy Foundation Gala. As the new board chair, I was about to present our year-end report, a year that had seen our book distribution program expand to 12 new schools and our reading comprehension scores improve by 30% in participating districts. When I first joined this foundation, I began, someone told me that the most powerful thing you can give a child is the belief that their story matters. Tonight, I want to share some of those stories with you. I spoke about Maria, a second grader whose confidence soared after we provided bilingual books for her classroom. About James, a fourth grader who went from remedial reading to grade level in 8 months. About the teacher in Eastside Elementary who wrote to thank us because her students were finally excited about reading time. The applause was warm and sustained, but what mattered more to me was the energy in the room, people genuinely moved by work that made a real difference in children's lives. This was what meaningful accomplishment felt like, not the polite appreciation I'd received for learning to make appropriate small talk at charity luncheons. After the presentation, I mingled with the crowd, wearing a dress I'd chosen because I loved the color, and it made me feel confident, not because it met some external standard of sophistication. My hair was styled simply, my makeup was done the way I preferred it, and I was wearing the silver charm bracelet Trevor had given me years ago. Helen, that was wonderful. Dr. Patricia Mills, the superintendent of schools, approached with a genuine smile. I had no idea the foundation was having such measurable impact. Have you considered expanding the program statewide? We talked for 20 minutes about education policy and funding strategies, a conversation that would have intimidated me 2 years ago but now felt natural. I had opinions based on experience, ideas rooted in actual knowledge of how children learn and what barriers they face. You should consider running for the school board, Dr. Mills said as our conversation wound down. We need people with your perspective and expertise. The school board. A year ago, I would have dismissed the suggestion immediately. What did a small-town librarian know about educational policy? But now I found myself intrigued. I did know things about education, about community needs, about how to make limited resources stretch to serve the greatest number of children. I'll think about it, I said, and meant it. Richard appeared at my elbow, beaming with pride. Outstanding presentation, Helen. I knew you were the right choice for this position. Thank you. It's been the most rewarding work I've ever done. And it shows. You're a natural leader when you're in your element. As the evening wound down, I helped clean up, stacking chairs and collecting programs with the same satisfaction I'd always found in practical work. This was who I was, someone who saw what needed to be done and did it, whether it was raising a child alone or expanding a literacy program, or making sure every detail of an event was handled properly. The drive home took me past Trevor and Vivien's old house, which now had a sold sign in the yard. They'd moved to Atlanta 3 weeks ago, and I'd heard about it through Richard rather than from them directly. Trevor had called twice since our confrontation. Once to attempt another explanation that started with, "You have to understand," and once to inform me of their moving date. Both conversations had been brief and strained. I'd sent a card to their new address with a simple message, "Wishing you happiness in your new adventure. Love, Mom." I meant it. I wanted Trevor to be happy, even if he'd decided that happiness required distance from me. At home, I found an unexpected envelope in my mailbox, thick cream paper with unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a wedding invitation from Sarah's daughter Emma, who was getting married next spring. "Aunt Helen," the handwritten note inside read, "I know you and Mom haven't talked much lately, but you've always been like family to me. I can't imagine getting married without you there. I hope you'll come celebrate with us. P.S. Mom says you've been doing amazing things with the Literacy Foundation. I'm so proud of you." I smiled, remembering Emma as a little girl who used to beg me to read her extra stories when I babysat. Now she was 26 and getting married, and she still thought of me as someone worth celebrating with. That evening, I called Sarah to RSVP and catch up. We talked for over an hour, falling back into the easy friendship that had sustained us since high school. "You sound different," Sarah observed. "Happier, more like yourself." "I feel more like myself." It took me a while to remember who that was. "And Trevor?" I considered how to answer. "Trevor is living his life in Atlanta. We're not estranged exactly, but we're not close either. He's working through his own issues about success and identity and what matters to him. I hope he figures it out." "That's very mature of you." "I'm 54 years old, Sarah. I don't have time to spend my remaining years trying to earn love from people who think it should be conditional." After we hung up, I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and the latest mystery novel I'd picked up at the library. Not because it would impress anyone at book club, but because I enjoyed mystery novels and always had. The simple pleasure of reading for my own enjoyment felt revolutionary after months of analyzing literary merit and cultural significance. My phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Saw the news coverage of tonight's event. You're becoming quite the local celebrity, well deserved." The local newspaper had indeed covered the gala, with a photo of me at the podium and a quote about the importance of community investment in early literacy. Helen Carlisle, board chair, the caption read, "Not Trevor's mother, not someone's social project, but Helen Carlisle, a woman doing meaningful work in her own right." I thought about the woman in the wedding photo from 2 years ago, perfectly dressed, appropriately silent, grateful for inclusion in conversations about topics that didn't interest her. She'd looked successful by external measures, but she'd been disappearing a little more each day. The woman sitting in this living room tonight was wearing comfortable clothes and reading a book she enjoyed in a house decorated with things that made her happy. She was leading a nonprofit organization, considering running for school board, and planning to attend a wedding where she'd be celebrated as herself rather than tolerated as an obligation. She'd lost a son, in a way. Trevor was still alive and well in Atlanta, but the relationship I'd hoped to build with him had proven impossible. He couldn't love me as I was, and I'd finally stopped trying to become someone he could love. But in letting go of that impossible goal, I'd rediscovered something more valuable: the woman who'd raised Trevor to be successful in the first place. The woman who'd built a good life from very little, who'd contributed to her community, who'd earned respect through competence and kindness rather than performance and accommodation. I'd learned that there was a difference between growing and disappearing, between improving yourself and erasing yourself. Real growth didn't require abandoning who you were. It meant becoming more fully yourself, more confident in your own worth, more generous from a place of strength rather than neediness. My name was Helen Carlisle, and I was done apologizing for taking up space in my own life. I was done measuring my worth by other people's comfort levels. I was done believing that love required me to become someone else. The boy who'd given me this charm bracelet when he was 14 had loved me exactly as I was. If the man he'd become couldn't find his way back to that love, that was his loss, not mine. But I would never again make the mistake of thinking I needed to earn what I'd already given freely for 28 years. I was enough. I had always been enough. And tomorrow, I would wake up as Helen Carlisle and continue building a life worthy of the woman who'd never needed anyone's permission to be extraordinary. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.